Welcome! In this series of videos, we will cover the design and implementation of a project, from initial design through coding and development to testing, using the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will start our project to explore designing our own web browser. There are a number of very well established web browsers in circulation. It's not the purpose of this project to supplant any of these. What we're intending to do is to produce our own web browser. This project is going to be as much about the journey as it is the destination. It's intended to be a learning exercise, to learn as we go. What is a web browser and how it works. So since a web browser is a client application running on a computer, we first have to create the client application. And we're currently sitting inside PowerBasic Forms Designer, where we're going to design the form the user will interact with. So we have created a form which we're going to center on screen. We're going to set this as thick frame, which means it will be a resizable window. We're going to give it a caption and a system menu. We're going to allow the user to be able to minimize it as well. And we will center it on the screen. Our web browser will not have a great deal in the way of controls on the form, but we will add a status bar, which will appear at the bottom of our dialog. And we'll just blank out the caption on that one. And we also want to set up a toolbar or some buttons at the top of the screen to allow the user to navigate. One of the tasks of a browser is to allow the user to move backwards and forwards in their list of HTML files displayed on screen. So we're going to add a number of image buttons to the top of our dialog. This will allow us to go backwards, forwards, to reload the current page, and also to go to a home page. We can always add more functionality as we go along. Another feature of current web browsers is the ability to display more than one page inside the client application. This is usually done in a series of tabs. So we're going to add a tab control to allow us to do something similar. And the area of our dialog that's going to have all the work done on it will be a graphics control. So these initially are the controls we will have on our dialog. So let's save these and we'll go back to our code. I'm going to add another library to our application to allow us to display tooltips to the user. This means when the user hovers over a control, a little tooltip will pop up to tell the user what the control is for. And as we're going to have a number of tabs, we'll need something to keep track of the tab handles and the pages we have actually storing on screen. So I'm going to create a couple of global variables to allow us to do that. And we'll call these tab count to keep track of the total number of tabs in use, and tab handles as an array to hold the handles of each of our tabs. So at the beginning of our application, we've got a number of named constants. These to keep track of our status bar, our tab control, a text box for which we're allowing the user to key in a URL, and 4 buttons, 4 image buttons, one for back, one for forward, one for reload, and one for home. And finally, our graphics area, where we're going to be drawing our HTML page. Additionally, we're going to add another library. This is one to allow us to do dynamic redrawing of the screen when the user maximizes or changes the size of the window. We'll cover what each of these parts does when we get to the point of resizing windows. Next, as we have 4 buttons on our client application, we want some image to display on the buttons. I have created a number of icons, one for the application itself and also for the home button, a back button, a next button, and also a small magnify button to allow us to put on the redraw button. So we're going to use the resource icon command to pull these into the application itself at compile time. As we created our dialog in the Forms Designer, it has created a resource at the beginning of the application, loading in a PBR. Now, I'm going to comment this one out for the moment, and all we really need is a manifest. So we're going to put a manifest command in at the beginning of our code. This is for the XP theme. Another thing we'll be wanting to use in our browser is one or more fonts. So we're going to set up a global font first of all to be our default font. So we'll create a global variable at the beginning of the application called font, and this will hold a handle to our font. So before we show this first dialog to the user, we're going to create our font within the application itself by declaring a local variable to set the font size, and then we will use the font new command. The font new command allows you to name the font we're going to be using. For the moment, we're going to be using Courier New, and we'll set its font size as 12 point. And the output from this command goes to populate the hfont variable we set up earlier. And once our application has been closed down, we'll do a tidy up to delete the memory used by the font. PowerBasic should do this for you at the end anyway, but it's always good practice to clean up after yourself. And now we will name our dialog as PB Lite Browser. So let's now go and have a look at the function which is going to display our browser to the user. So here we have the function which is going to create and display our browser. We've placed a piece of text, PB Lite Browser, in the title of our dialog. And our dialog has all the properties to allow the user to both maximize it, minimize it, and resize it. We've added the status bar, a text box to allow the user to key in a URL, and we have 4 buttons, 4 image buttons. One for going back, one for forward, one for reload, and one for home. And finally, we have a tab control to allow tabs to appear to the user. What we haven't added yet is our graphics control, and we will set our graphics control up next. I'm going to set it for 600 wide and 250 high. These are dialog units. And we will do this before the graphics show command is actually used. So these are placed on the dialog before the dialog is displayed to the user. So we're using the control add graphic command to place our graphic on the screen. Next we have to tell PowerBasic that we want to do a graphics attach command. This tells PowerBasic which graphics control that all subsequent graphics commands are going to be directed towards. This is necessary even although we only have one graphics control in the application. We can do this by using the graphics attach command. And we're using the redraw option to ensure that nothing is drawn to the user until we are quite ready. So in order to see what space our graphics control is actually taking up on the dialog, we're going to colour it in a solid colour. So we can use the graphics clear command to perform that. This will clear the graphics control and set the background to black in colour. So let's try running the application now and see how far we've got. And there is our dialog on screen. We have the 4 buttons, we have the text box to allow the user to key in a URL, and we have a tab which is not yet named, and we have a graphics control which takes up the remainder of our dialog. So this is the basics, the beginnings of our form. Next we will look at populating our image buttons. So let's go back to the code where we set up the dialog. So we're going to use a series of control set image button commands. These are to specify the image that's to be used with each of our buttons. These are the resources we created earlier on, starting with 2000 and going up to 2003. So let's run the application again and see if these images have been brought in correctly. And there we have 4 images on the 4 buttons: a back, a forward, a reload, and a home button. The image in the home button is not taking up the full size of the button. So in order to get around that, you can either recreate your image to be the correct size, or you can use the image button X command, which will stretch the image slightly to fit the button. So we will take this line of code out, and we will use a Control Set Image X button to populate that. So since we're using Image Button X, when we create the home, we need to use Image X up here as well. So if we run our code again, we'll see that the home button is now correctly populated. So how do we get the tabs visible on our screen? Once more, back to the code. If we go to the callback function, the event handler, there's some work we need to put in the initialization section at the top of this function. We want to insert the initial tab page. So we're going to create a local variable to handle that. And we'll put that at the top of our function. And we will use the tab insert page command. This takes a number of parameters: the dialog handle, the handle of the tab control, the tab number, and the text we want to place on that tab. And the output from that command is going to populate this variable here, which we've just created. And we'll want to store the value of that so we can handle when a user changes from one tab to another. So we're going to redim our global array we've set up for the tab handles. And we'll populate the first element of that array to be the value we just got back when the tab insert command was run. So if we run our code once more, we can see we have incrementally moved further forward. We've now got a tab with the word home on it. For the beginning of this project, we'll be using just one tab, but at a later point in the project, we'll allow the user to add additional tabs, allowing the user to have multiple web pages in the dialog at the same time. So the next thing we'll want to do is to ensure that the focus for the first view of this dialog is on the URL control, the text control. So we can quite easily do that by using a Control Set Focus command. Control Set Focus takes only two parameters, the dialog handle and the handle of the control you wish to have focus. As I said at the beginning of the video, we want some tooltips appearing on our controls. So we're going to make use of the tooltip library. And to save a bit of typing, I'm going to use a prefix command here. The prefix command is very useful, saves you a bit of typing, makes the code look tidier, and at compile time, the first part of the prefix, this part here, is prepended at the beginning of each line of code that follows it. So we put a line of code in here, specifying the handle of the URL text box and a piece of text we want to place on it. If we run that code now, our application will load, and when we hover over the text box, we get a tooltip popping up. So we want to do the same for each of these tooltips. But additionally, I want to colour these tooltips in to make them more visible to the user. We can do this quite easily as there are two optional parameters that can be added to the end of this call. And that gives us the two colours, one for background and one for foreground. So if we try running the application one more time, the application should load, and we should have a tooltip in colour on the text box. So we just have to do the same for each of these other four controls. So there we have now 5 controls with tooltips on them: the URL, the back, the forward, the home, and the reload buttons. So when the application loads for the very first time, there will be only a home page displayed. Therefore, there's no need for the back and the forward buttons to be activated, so we will disable them initially until we load an HTML page. And we can do that quite easily by using the control disable command, which takes two parameters, the dialog handle and the handle of the control we wish to disable. If we run the application now, we will see that the first two buttons are grayed out and tooltips will automatically not appear. All the other buttons are still fully functional. The graphics control is currently sitting with a black background. The reason for this will become obvious when I attempt to maximize the dialog. As you can see, the dialog has been maximized, but each of the controls has not been expanded to make use of the space gained when the screen is maximized. So this is where we're going to be using our resize code. So let's go back to the code. Still within the callback function, the event handler, we'll need to put a new event in. This is to handle resize events. This event is called WMSize. The first thing is we'll put a couple of commands in, one to send to the status bar, and one to check to see if the dialog has been minimized. If the dialog has been minimized, there's no point in resizing anything, because the user cannot see it. Next, we want to call our resize function. This is the single function within our resize module. So we first call that to allow it to be initialized. Now we'll want to resize some controls, and we'll need to create a function to perform that action. So we'll call that resize controls, and we'll pass it the single parameter, which is the handle to the dialog. And here is the skeleton of our resize controls function. So we have 3 controls on this dialog we'll want to resize. First of all, the URL text box. Next, the tab control, and finally, the graphics control. The text control needs to be expanded horizontally, as does the tab control, and we can do that quite easily by a call to a resize function. The first call is to scale horizontally the text URL control, and we're doing exactly the same for the tab control, so they should expand to the right as the dialog is increased in size. Next, we need to do our graphics control. Our graphics control not only has to become wider, it has to become taller as well. So it has to be scaled both horizontally and vertically. So these 2 commands should allow that to happen. Once you have resized all the controls on the screen, we need to repaint the form so the user can actually see it. And this can be done by again calling resize, but this time passing a parameter to say repaint. If we try running this now, our application will run, we can maximize our screen, and we can see our text box is now the full width of the dialog, as is the tab control. Now the graphics control has actually been made larger, but it's not obvious because we have not coloured back in the graphics control to set its background colour. So let's go back to the code to prove that we have indeed resized the graphics control. And we can do that by repainting the graphics control as a black background, and then giving it a graphic redraw command. If we run that code now, if we resize the dialog, we can see the graphics control is now showing that it's taking up all the space on the dialog. And if we minimize again, and we use the gadgets to make it wider, we can see it will now go quite happily. But the dialog has a minimum size. It will not go beyond that minimum size. But it will go up to whatever size your application can fit on your current screen. So we've now performed the basics of getting our browser ready. We have the controls to allow the user to navigate, and we have a URL box to allow the user to key in either a URL to a website or a file path to a file on your local machine. And we have a tab control currently displaying the word home. Below that we have a graphics control into which our HTML code is going to be rendered. So this is the absolute basics of an application that's going to become a web browser. What we'll do in the next video is we will create a very simple web page, and we will allow our application to load this web page up and render it on screen. However, that's it for today. Thank you for watching.